And then there's all the action in the race to take on Trump in 2020. A new Time magazine cover depicting Trump looking back over his shoulder as a crowded field of declared and potential candidates eyes the Oval Office. 2 days ago, a major candidate formally entered the race, promptly raised nearly $6 million in just 24 hours. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, the runner-up for the Democratic nomination last time around, declaring the time had come to, quote, complete the revolution and make his vision a reality. Joining me now for his first primetime interview since declaring his candidacy, Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders. Senator, let me just start with the emergency declaration, since that's in the news today. Chuck Schumer says the Senate's going to introduce a resolution as well to pair with the House. Do you support that resolution?
Of course I do. What the president is doing is unconstitutional, it's illegal, and it is part of his movement toward an authoritarian society. This guy clearly is not familiar with the Constitution, clearly not familiar with the separation of powers. He thinks he's got it all. He's the only one running the government, and that has got to stop.
You ran for president in 2016. I think that it was a long race. It was a hard-fought race. It's a very different world 2 years later for a lot of reasons. There's probably a dozen or so candidates or more who will be in the race. The issue platforms have changed quite a bit. There's several candidates who've endorsed Medicare for All or free college, which are issues that you would champion. Why'd you take a look at this race this time and say, I have to run again?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons, Chris. First of all, I'm proud of what we accomplished in 2016. And I'm proud that we changed the political discourse in this country, that ideas that today are widely accepted, are part of the mainstream, are being supported by many Democratic candidates. If you will recall, 3 years ago, why these ideas was considered to be radical and extreme and fringe ideas. So we have come a long way, I think, in transforming the Democratic Party and making it into a more progressive party. Second of all, part of the political revolution was to mobilize millions of people at the grassroots level. And what I'm very proud of, in terms of what we have accomplished in the last 2 days, the media talks about the money, that's great. But we now have close to 1 million people who have signed up, who want to be involved in an unprecedented campaign. And why that's important is that I believe from the bottom of my heart that if you learn from the civil rights movement, from the trade union movement, from the women's movement, from the gay movement, you know that real change in this country never occurs unless millions of people are standing up and fighting back. So if we are going to pass Medicare for all, we need to mobilize millions of people to stand up to the insurance companies and the drug companies. That's what this campaign is about.
I want to ask another question about this campaign versus last campaign, because obviously that was a very hard-fought primary. It went on for a very long time. It was competitive in a way I think some people didn't expect at the beginning of it. And if you're going to win this time, there are people who voted for Hillary Clinton the last time around whose votes you will need this time in a Democratic primary. And there's still some bad blood. I mean, there are still folks who I talk to who exist in the political world who are loyal Democrats who feel frustrated by what they felt was your lack of loyalty to the party or your support of Hillary Clinton or extending the primary too long. And my question to you is, what is the message for those folks out there who may have sort of feelings about that?
You know, I do understand that, Chris, but let's get the facts correct. After I endorsed Hillary Clinton, I went all over this country and I worked as hard as I could to see that she was elected. And I think we should get that clear. I think the main point to be made is that where we are right now is that many of the major issues that I have been talking about for years are now widely supported by the American people. And what we have got to do is take Trump's desire to divide us up by the color of our skin or where we were born or our sexual orientation or our agenda. We have got to bring our people together around a progressive agenda. Healthcare is a human right. We're going to raise that minimum wage to $15 an hour. We are going to, in a highly competitive global economy, make public colleges and universities tuition-free and lower student debt. We are going to address the existential crisis of climate change, transform our energy system, and create millions of jobs in the process. Criminal justice reform, immigration reform. Those ideas are now ideas that the overwhelming majority of the Democratic party believe in, and we got to bring people together around that agenda.
One more question about 2016 and about your campaign, because you were mayor of Burlington Vermont, so you have some executive experience, but that campaign was a large enterprise that you were managing. There's been some complaints. It's been well reported. I know you met with some folks from the campaign about the culture and atmosphere in that campaign, particularly as it pertains to sexual harassment being tolerated, and the diversity of the senior leadership of that campaign at a time when the Democratic Party is a diverse party, being excessively white and male and not having enough voices. Do you take those criticisms to heart, or are you doing things differently this time?
Absolutely. We take those criticisms to heart. When people said that our campaign was too white, too male-oriented, they are right. You take a look at the staff that we are putting together right now. Take a look at who our national co-chairs are. You will see a fundamental difference in the way our campaign is operating. In terms of the issue of sexual harassment, that has troubled me immensely. And we are putting together a protocol now which will be stronger than any campaign has ever put together so that we prevent any of the problems we saw in 2016.
You just talked about a lot of issues that are issues that you feel passionately about, that you've campaigned about: Medicare for all, climate and the Green New Deal, criminal justice reform. But prioritization seems a key question in this primary, and it's a question I've been asking every candidate we've had on, which is, what is your you're inaugurated, and by an electoral miracle or a lot of hard work, the Democrats have a majority in the Senate and in the House. What's your first piece of big domestic legislation that you move?
I don't look at it that way, Chris. What I look at is looking at a 100-day period and pushing forward that progressive agenda. We've got to raise that minimum wage to a living wage. We have to pass Medicare for all. We have to transform our energy system. So I don't see it as one piece of legislation. We have enormous crises in this country in terms of income and wealth inequality, in terms of millions of people living in poverty, in terms of a shrinking middle class. It's not just one issue. We need a progressive agenda. That's what I'm going to be campaigning on. Right. But let me tell you something else.
Wait a second. Let me just stop you there for a second. Because you're a United States Senator who knows your way around the legislative process, and you know how important political capital and sequencing are, and prioritization. We know that parties come in and they have priorities, and those priorities, when they come in first, those bills get the best sort of amount of force behind them, and then you go later through an administration and they get less and less. That's just the facts of how things work.
Well, I think you're looking at the past. You're not looking at, I think, what life would be like if I'm going to be elected president of the United States. There's going to be a sense of urgency. We are not going to do things the same old way. We have major crises in this country, and especially after 4 years of the disaster of what will be the disaster of Trump, if he lasts 4 years, we're going to have to move rapidly in addressing issue after issue after issue. And let me mention some other issues I think that have not been talked about. We have to pay more attention to rural America. Life expectancy going down, opioid epidemic, young people leaving their communities. We have to pay more attention to rural communities. We have to pay attention to the impact that artificial intelligence and robotics is having on our society in driving people out of the jobs they've had for years. So there's an enormous amount of work to be done. And we are going to need a president and a Congress to focus on issue after issue to transform the economic and political life of this country.
We've talked a lot about domestic issues, and you've been fairly active on some foreign policy issues, particularly on Yemen, where you've worked with some senators across the aisle on the War Powers Resolution, which was successful in the last Congress and might come up again. And there's been reporting about sort of your foreign policy staff being filled out more. I wonder, like, is there a Sanders doctrine? Is there a way that you view American leadership and foreign policy were you to become president?
In 30 seconds or less, right?
Exactly. Well, 15. I got to get some other stuff.
All right. You got a president today who supports, literally supports authoritarian regimes all over the world, who supports governments run by kleptocrats who are billionaires. My vision of American leadership in the world is leadership which supports democracy, supports human rights, supports the entire world coming together to address the planetary crisis of climate change. And I see huge potential in the world, people all over the world saying, you know what, it affects China, it affects India, it affects the United States. We've got to work together. I see a world beginning to address massive global income and wealth inequality, where today you have a few hundred people owning more wealth than the bottom half of the world's population. I see us addressing the problems of global poverty. So I see us being the country where the rest of the world looks to the United States and says, thank you, America, for supporting human rights, democracy, and economic justice.
I want to ask you about socialism. There's an email that went out, I think, in the last few days from the Trump campaign, which, of course, is already up and running. It's a fundraising email. It says, Bernie Sanders announced he will be running for president in 2020 with a very simple platform, full-blown socialism, not partial socialism, full-blown socialism. You've called yourself a socialist for years. It's been a question, interestingly, I think, on the campaign trail. Other candidates have said they're not socialists, they're capitalists. But there's this debate that has ensued about what does that mean. A lot of conservatives have pointed to Venezuela and said food shortages, increasing authoritarianism is what socialism means, and it's what Bernie Sanders wants. What is your definition of socialism? What's your model for it?
I think that when we look at a modern, democratic, civilized society, you're looking at economic rights in addition to political freedoms. So right now we have a constitution, you have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. I happen to believe that in the year 2019, with all of the wealth around us, we can create an economy which guarantees health care to all people as a human right, which guarantees education from childcare to higher education as a human right, which guarantees the right of people to have decent and affordable housing, which makes sure that you're living in a community where the water that you are drinking and the air that you are breathing is clean.
Let me ask you this,
economic rights as human rights. That's what I mean. And by the way, Chris,
but how is that
a radical idea.
Right, that's my question, right? So what you're describing is the mixed economy, and there's a National Health Service in the UK. There are the United States has public housing, right? We have public provisions of those goods. Is there something over and above that distinguishes your vision from a kind of welfare state mixed economy?
Well, I should also add that in 1944, this is exactly what Franklin Delano Roosevelt talked about. He talked about jobs and health care and education as a human right to be guaranteed by the government. And what I'm talking about exists in many countries all over the world. You go to countries in Scandinavia, college education is free. Every other major country on earth guarantees health care to all people as a right. Most countries have higher minimum wages than we do. So essentially what we are talking about is making sure that a vibrant democracy makes sure and guarantees that all of our people can have a decent standard of living, and that we do not have this grotesque level of income and wealth inequality where 3 people end up owning more wealth than the bottom half of the country, where a handful of billionaires can spend hundreds of millions of dollars to buy elections. That's what the political revolution is about. That's what democratic socialism means to me.
So let me return to the Venezuela case, because it has been so used by conservatives in the U.S. On exactly this. You've been critical of the Maduro regime. I think also critical of some of the steps taken by the Trump administration, sort of ratcheting up pressure. But what is the Bernie Sanders theory of the case for why Venezuela is the way it is? What went wrong there in what was an avowedly socialist project?
Oh, well, I mean, that's a long story that I don't think we have the time to get into. But this is what I will say, and that is that I think there must be free and fair elections in Venezuela. The last elections were not free. Second of all, we have got to do everything that we can to provide humanitarian aid along with other countries so that people do not starve to death. And thirdly, we need to make certain that the United States does not do what it has done time and time again in our history, and that is get involved in overthrowing governments in Latin America. We did that in Chile. We did that in Brazil, Guatemala, other countries. We should not be doing that now. The future of Venezuela must rest with the Venezuelan people, not the Trump administration.
You spoke before about a political revolution, talked about an ambitious 100-day agenda. One of the kind of bottlenecks for all of that right now is the House of Congress you call your own, the United States Senate. It has a filibuster, which, as we know from the history, increased rapidly in its deployment. It's essentially used as a 60-vote threshold for almost everything other than a reconciliation and budgeting. Some people have come out in favor of abolishing the filibuster. Do you favor abolishing the filibuster?
Well, one of those people is Donald Trump. So I think we should be thoughtful and clear about this is what Trump would like to see. Look, before we get into that, which is a very legitimate question, we need to, A, make sure the Democrats control the United States Senate, which is not guaranteed by any means.
No,
and
it
second
is not.
second of all, it's not good enough to have 51 Democrats. Or 50 Democrats and a Democratic president. It is important to have progressive Democrats, because if you think that every Democrat currently in the United States Senate is going to support a progressive agenda, think twice. That's not the case.
Right, but isn't that even more the case for 60 votes?
I think what we have got to do, I mean, you're asking a legitimate question, but I think let's get first things first. Let's elect the Democratic Senate. Let's make sure that as many as possible are progressives. But this is what I believe. It's what I said a moment ago. We make change when millions of people demand that change. Right. And I believe that when people stand up and fight back, yes, you're going to have the United States Congress start listening to ordinary Americans rather than wealthy campaign contributors.
All right, Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator from Vermont, thanks so much for taking time tonight. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.